Madam President, members of the board, Mr. Heath, it is our annual requirement, by statutory requirement, to get the FY25 annual appropriations completed and approved. So we'll present that to the board. I will mention last Thursday we presented this to the Citizens Financial Advisory, and they do recommend the board's consideration and approval of the appropriations. Our appropriations are built, they start actually in January. You know, we start this process in January when the board approves the tax budget is the first action of the board in January. Thank you, Mr. Heath. I don't want Ms. Mazika yelling at me again. So then we go into March when we get the certifications done for the new rates, and then obviously that's when we start to build the budget. This process starts in the spring with the building principals and the directors and Mr. Heath and his team starting to look at our appropriations, because our goal is to get them pretty much done by the end of the fiscal year. So when we adopt our temporary appropriations at the usually end of June 30th meeting, that we're pretty much adopting what our appropriations are going to be. We aren't required by law to adopt the full appropriations till September, and we use that time then to really solidify the hiring process through the HR department, so that when we bring the appropriations to the board in the community in September, that it's as close as we can believe it to be for the actual year. So obviously a lot of that work's done, and it kind of goes back to our strategic plan and our new strategic plan, which was approved at the last board meeting. When it comes to the budgeting principles, really from our standpoint, it kind of goes to outcome 5, which I shared with the community last month. And really we're trying to maximize the district efficiency and efficacy, and we're doing that so that we can operate at peak capacity by providing knowledge, skills, and resources necessary to reach the desired student outcomes. So when we build our budget and we're looking at staffing and we're looking at all the things that we're doing, it really guys goes back to the strategic plan, and specifically for my office, we're looking at the maximization of the district efficiencies and efficacy. When you think about it from what we did before in our old strategic plan, the 2 guiding principles that continue to move forward with us as we go into our new strategic plan is we have to maintain and enhance our fiscal stability by focusing our attention on and diligence on short term, which is really what our appropriations are. It is our short-term goals for the year, as well as our long-term financial planning, which we update the board and community on in November and May. And we always have to remember that there's options for alternative revenue and to maximize our existing personnel, facilities, and resources so that we're running, again, with that efficiency and efficacy that we spoke of. We've continued to have our budgeting principles of all fiscal decisions should be made in the context of the 5-year forecast, that long-term planning. We know that there's management options attached to every dollar that we spend. We know that every dollar spent must add value to teaching and learning. And we must aggressively focus on our largest expense areas, which are salaries, benefits, and special education. Try to catch up here. Hard to see behind me. In our facilities. And we know that quality is always cheaper in the long run. So when we look at kind of where our money comes from, the majority of our revenue comes from our local taxpayer. About 73.1% comes from the form of property tax from our local taxpayer as a resident in our commercial property. We receive another 22.6% from the state. In the general fund, we get very little federal funding. Most of the federal funding, as we've talked about at the last board meeting, is outside of the general fund. It's in restricted fund areas so that it can be tracked. So though, again, this always comes up as a point of contention. It only makes up 0.6% of our general fund. It does actually equate to almost $8 million in total funding, but it's all outside the general fund. And then we have another 3.7% that comes from intermediate and other funds through our investments, our receipts that we have on sale of property that we no longer use, and other revenue streams that come in, like ticket revenue and so on and so forth. When you compare that to the state, obviously that looks much different. The state average for local revenue is at 42%, and the state percentage is 43%. Because Mentor is considered a wealthy district based on our median income and our property valuation, that burden gets shifted to the local taxpayer. When we look at our year-over-year revenue comparison, ultimately the bottom right is the most important for this slide. When we look at our appropriations, we're expecting our property tax, our total revenue, to go up to $110.7 million, or almost $110.8 million, up from last year where we closed out the year at $109.7, almost $109.8 million. Again, majority of that coming from local resources and the state sources that we shared on the last slide. It's important to look, I think, when you look at our revenue, we see relatively flat revenue, but we get very little revenue growth from the way that the state funding is and the way that local property taxes fund schools. We do see a little bit of an increase, as I've shared a number of times, on the inside millage with the property valuations. As we've said, though valuations of the district have went up by 25%, we're only going to see a small increase in value coming on inside millage to the district at the tune of right around 2%, which is going to cost the local taxpayer about $42 per $100,000 in market value. So obviously the next part of the budget, or the most important part of the appropriations, is our expenses. And because we're in the business of educating kids, district enrollment trends are very important in that, and projecting that and making sure that we have the staffing ratios that Mrs. Jessling shared in her report to meet the strategic plan. Since FY21, we've seen a decrease in student enrollment, as many of the districts across the state in Lake County have as well. When we look at our trend analysis, again, in our grade bands, you can see that we are starting to see pretty much a leveling off of the kindergarten numbers, and we're seeing the decrease as the larger classes go through the high school and start to graduate. We had a graduating class over 600 kids, I believe, Mr. Heath, correct, last year, and we only had 448 kids come into the district, which is pretty on par statistically with our birth rate ratio that we have, because we look at that. We look at the live birth rate 5 years ago, and we look at how many of the kids are coming in, and we're close to, consistently in the upper 90s, almost to 100%. Sometimes we go over, and that trend has been pretty consistent over the last 10 years, even going back to 2014. So that's something that we look at. You look at the live birth rate, and you look at the kids that show up then from 5 years later in the kindergarten rate. So we look at it as a standpoint is, okay, we're starting to see where that trend is going, and obviously that impacts us where it impacts us in staffing. So here's where we look at our EMIS reporting for the various codes, and they're on the screen. The big piece here is that our staffing is going down 2.94% this year. A majority of that reduction is, again, and this on the screen, just to clarify for the board and the community, this is for every fund. This isn't just general fund. So we've talked about this in the past. The ESSER support staff that was being put in place over the last few years because of COVID to kind of close those achievement gaps. This is the first year that they're no longer here because those funds have run out, and Mr. Heath and his team made the determination that we would find other ways to support students who have gaps, because we did close quite a bit of those gaps. We know gaps still exist, but that's more in the purview of our superintendent than myself. Myself is to look at kind of where that puts us financially, and we see that staffing has continued to decrease.
Mr. Wade, does that 2.9% include the ESSER-funded teachers then?
It does,
Okay.
yeah. So that's total staff out of all
Got it.
funds.
Thank you.
Does that decrease? So, this is a graph that I have shown in the past. The orange line shows the decline in enrollment in the district since 2009. So this isn't something that's just come out of nowhere. We've been seeing this decline in enrollment since prior to even my first stint here in the district. But you can see that going back to Dr. Hoynes and Mr. Miller and Mr. Porter, we have a decreasing staff ratio too, because that represents the blue line. You can see during COVID in 21, we saw an increase of staffing. That was so that we could open school back up for the 21-22 school year. And we had smaller class sizes, so we added staff, and then we had the ESSER teachers in, and you can see then again after that 21 21-22 school year, we went kind of back down to the normal trends of decreasing enrollment and decreasing staffing. This is through fiscal year 23. The 24 data will be released from the state here in probably November, December, and I will update the board and the community on this chart again, because it's just something that we continue to track to make sure that we're being consistent. Reason being is 83.4% of our budget, as this slide shows, comes from salary and benefits. And because 83.4% of our budget comes to salary and benefits, it's highly important that we continue to make sure that our enrollment and staffing ratios are going in the same direction and in proportion. You can see that the other major area that we have in the district is purchase services. That's 10.5% of our budget, and those are the services that we purchase to support student learning and running the district. Then we have our supplies coming in at 4%. So if you want to see the numbers, the last column, you can see there's a 5-year trend here of the actuals from fiscal year 21 through fiscal year 24, what we're budgeting. I share this with the community so that you can kind of see the trends that we're having, and most importantly, that we're looking to appropriate about $115.671 million, which is up 3.44% from last year, so right around the inflationary increase. Those numbers assume the staffing numbers that we had before. The salaries includes the 2.75% increase that the negotiated agreement has. It also has a 7% increase for projected growth on healthcare in January 1, because our healthcare rates will change in January. We'll have clearer numbers on that as we go into the November forecast update. And it does assume the increases in staffing, even that Mr. Heath had shared with us with regards to transportation with 3 drivers and 2 aides, correct?
Correct.
It does include 1 certified staff member reduction and a reduction in a classified position as well. The bottom line, just as a point of reference, because we've always kind of looked at this, because prior to this year, this is again the first year that we haven't made a large transfer out of the general fund to support either the capital improvement fund or because of the retirement incentive. So if you normalize that and you normalize it out for the net reserve to the 5-year capital plan and retirements, we see an increase of 6.57% from last year from a budget to actual. Again, looking at graphs, these graphs allow us to kind of quickly analyze and kind of check ourselves to make sure that we don't see anything out of the ordinary. So I think they're important to share with the community and the board, because I would hope that if you saw something that stands out, let's just say like fiscal year 23, and we see that it's much higher than the rest of the areas, we should be able to explain that, right? That's the job of the board and the community, to continue to make sure that they're checking on the work that we're doing. And if we remember, in 23, that's the year we made the decision, instead of making annual contributions to the capital plan, we made the decision to move it all at once and then stretch that out rather than doing it annually. I think you can see from the budgeted appropriations that we have in fiscal year 25, there's nothing that's really atypical with the prior year trends. So again, it's just another check, visual check, for those of us who are more visual than rather than numerical, looking at those things. It's important to also remember that our board has a policy that states that we must have a 15% budget reserve, and part of that policy is that we actually have a general fund operating budget reserve fund. That fund cannot exceed 5% of the prior year's revenue. So by policy and by law, and we're audited on this, the general fund operating budget reserve can't exceed $5.481 million. So with that, looking at our interest income over the last few years, we have to keep a close eye on that interest income, and it can't exceed about $55,000, because if we do, we'd have to then have board action to reduce that fund, because the money in that fund can only be spent with board action per policy. So again, going back all the way to your fiscal year 2016, when we passed our last new money levy, you can see that the cash balance was increasing because we were not deficit spending at that time, and that continued to go on through fiscal year 20. Our first year deficit spending was in fiscal year 21, and we've continued that trend, and we will continue that trend into this fiscal year 25 budget that we're looking for appropriation approval. The bottom line is then, last year we reduced, because of the deficit spend, the general fund balance from $55.9 million to $53.8 million approximately. The approximate $4 million in deficit spending that we're going to potentially observe this year, if the budget holds true, would then bring us down to an ending balance of $48.9 or $48.89 million in cash reserve. We'll have encumbrances at the end of the year. Remember, encumbrances is money that's been, because we're cash basis, is money that we have spent, but the check hasn't been sent out yet because we haven't received the good or service. So that causes us to have encumbrances at the end of the fiscal year. You take that into account, and you take into account that our policy states that, again, you as a board cannot allow our budget reserve to fall below the general fund cash set aside, which is $11.3 million. So you add the general fund reserve to that, which was about $5.4 million, to that 11.3. So we're looking at about $16.9 million is the floor by policy that the board has that we can't fall below in the way that we're spending. So when you take that all of that into consideration, so you take the encumbrances out, you take the general fund cash set aside out, and you don't include the budget reserve, our cash balance is $37.5 million at the end of the fiscal year. When we look at, just to kind of reiterate and kind of bring everything together, our appropriations are tied to our forecast. The May forecast is the first part of again that budgeting process, and that we're forecasting out kind of where our budget is. I am happy to announce that we're within 1.6%. The current appropriations is going to exceed the forecast for May. I would expect that by the end of the fiscal year, we will not spend the $15.6 million. We've typically been about 2 or 3% below the actual appropriation. So it's a pretty accurate reflection, but when you look at it, again, I think this is something that the board should look at. A board of education should be looking at, okay, and keeping me honest and checking me on, all right, what's our forecast say? What does the appropriation say? Do they align? Are they close? And again, that's why every month when I give my monthly financials, I show it versus, well, this is what we spent last year at this time, this is what we received in revenue last year at this time, this is where we were year to date, and this is how it compares against our forecast. So these are all checks and balances to make sure that we as a community and a board are aware of where we're at and where we're headed, so that we don't get into a Mount Healthy situation or some of the other districts that have had some financial crises because we weren't checking, everyone wasn't doing their checks and balances that we have going on. So we are a little bit higher than we were looking in May. Again, I wouldn't mind having, what is that, about $1.9 million. That's a lot of money to everybody in this room. However, when you're looking at a $150 million budget, it's only a difference of 1.6%, so it's not material. And again, I think when we get down to the actual spending and looking at where we're at, even in November, we'll see a difference of that in reality. And I always think it's important to, again, as part of the appropriations, and I know we've had this discussion in the past with regards to the capital plan. We present this in June to the board and to the community, but part of the appropriations for this fiscal year is that capital plan. And I think what the key is here is that we've identified safety and maintenance improvements, and this is just really what we need to do to maintain the safety and the maintenance of the facilities. And that exceeds our PI levy by about $1.8 million. And then we have our technology purchases, furniture purchases, and our vehicle purchases. But we know this year that we're not doing furniture and we're not doing buses. And we do need to replace one of our trucks, so that's included. So that's another about $700,000 in costs. So it's about a $3.5 million cost to the district when we only have a permanent improvement levy that covers about $1 million of that. I am sharing a little bit of what we're looking at kind of going forward, but I think it's important in this situation with the appropriations to show that our average cost that we're projecting and even spending this year is about $2 million less than it was prior to the failure of the PI levy that was put on the ballot in November. So decisions have been made, reductions have, and we will stretch that money further than we were expecting. So again, I'm happy to answer any questions on the appropriations, which specifically relates to the all funds, the expected budgets that you'll see at the back of the appropriations document that I've shared with you. Again, this was presented to our Citizens Financial Advisory last Thursday and was recommended for approval by the Board of Education.